Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Styanax. First things first, let's go into the builds. So I've probably tried a total of 50 different Styanax builds, and I'm not even exaggerating. I have 5 builds here, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. This is a first build, opting for a shield tank build, opting for Condemn to keep our shields up in conjunction with this 3. You may notice that I have a lot of mods that make us tankier when we're in the air, such as Boreal's Hatred, Aerodynamic, and Aviator, and this is because Styanax has no form of damage reduction in his kit at all, so without these you cannot survive in extended missions, even with his 3, just because DR matters so much, especially in some place like Moot, where the enemies deal 4 times more damage. The second build is an extension to this build, but it is significantly tankier. We are running Uneru instead of Madurai, and what this does is it allows us to slot Aviator in the Exilus slot, and it frees up mod spaces in the build. What this does is allows us to run Umbral mods to increase our health pool and our armor even further. That way, whenever our shield breaks, we have a bit of health cushion to also utilize. Ideally, this build would also drop Blind Rage for Umbral Intensify to buff Umbral Vitality and Umbral Fiber further, and then obviously Umbral Fiber would ideally be a higher rank. Keep in mind that depending on the content that you're doing, you can free up mod slots in these 2 builds by dropping Aviator or Boreal's Hatred or Boreal's Anguish, depending on how much DR you need for the content that you're doing. As for the third build, this is the Shield Gate build, and a quick pause here to mention that in this build, I was looking at natural talent to see how quickly some of the abilities would cast, and that is actually not what you need to slot. For this build to function with these mods, you need an Augur mod equipped on the main build, so natural talent has to be replaced with an Augur mod, and I would personally recommend Augur Reach. And this is probably my favorite build of the 5, as it was the most simplistic, albeit it still wasn't fantastic. I tried probably 10 different renditions of this build alone, and another thing I would recommend is, you may notice that I replaced his 2 for Terrify. I would recommend just getting rid of his 4 and having 2 different abilities that armor strip. Why? Well, put simply, his 4 is absolutely terrible. You can die while you're casting it, and not only that, it just doesn't deal that much damage unless you actually mod for it to deal damage. What do I mean by modding for it to deal damage? Well, it's not as simple as just building strength. This ability also scales with weapon damage buffs, like Arcane Arachne and Vigorous Swap, or the Naramon Lethal Levitation passive. Without these buffs, this ability does not deal that much damage in the Seal Path. People like to think it does, but it really doesn't. That, and combined with the fact that you can just simply die while casting it, makes this ability absolutely terrible, but it is, well, it used to be really fun, and you might still find it fun. But the reason why you might want to keep his Thero Strike is because it works on Acolytes, whereas Terrify doesn't. Now you may be asking, why run Terrify at all, since we already have a built-in armor strip? And that's because this one is a radial armor strip rather than a conal, so you have to cast it less often, and on top of that, it costs more energy, which is the most important part, as this is a shield gate build, and Styanax has 188 shield, even with the Decaying Dragon Key. So we need a high cost ability that also CCs enemies, which is exactly what Terrify offers us, which makes it a really good ability to use for a shield gate build with Styanax, especially in conjunction with Creeping Terrify. Natural Talent is a flex slot, you can put anything you want here. As for the 4th build, it is Parasitic Armor. This build was extremely tanky. This final slot would be Vigor or Primed Vigor if you have it, and if you have the capacity for them. I, however, do not. Parasitic Armor basically just makes Styanax a worse Night Equinox. As for the final build, this was the first rendition of my Styanax build back before he was nerfed relentlessly. This build no longer works, unfortunately. This build utilized Vigorous Swap for Breach Surge and his 4, because Breach Surge and his 4, like I mentioned earlier, both scale off of Vigorous Swap, but this build just doesn't really function in high level content anymore. As for the rest of the build, you have to use your best primary weapon. Unlike Nidus, where I was using the Brahma because he was able to use it in a interesting way, such as being able to slot Prime Firestorm for additional AoE, you have to use your best AoE weapon on Styanax because his kit really doesn't allow you to use anything but the meta weapons, which is just the unfortunate reality. As for the secondary, I opted for a Viral Radiation Epitaph build. If you're going the Shield Gate build, you need to run the Augur mods instead. But if you're not going a Shield Gate build, you can do Viral Radiation. This helps for survivability, as rad procs will soft CC the enemies. As for your melee weapon, I was just simply using the Guandao Prime. That way I could slot Boreal's Contempt for a further 20% damage reduction while in the air. Obviously, if you're going the Shield Gate build, you are free to use whatever you want as your melee weapon. Focus schools are, of course, Uneru or Madurai, depending on your build and depending on what you want. Madurai gives you 40% ability strength and 50% casting speed. Uneru allows you to drop Prime Sure-Footed from your build, and it gives you 200 armor. If you do not have Prime Sure-Footed, I would recommend using Uneru at all times, as I found Styanax to be the Warframe that needs Prime Sure-Footed more than any other frame I've ever played. And now for the cat, it is just a standard Panzer build with the synth mods equipped. Alright, now moving on to the ranking portions of the video, we will be discussing Styanax in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, his KPM, secondly, his survivability, thirdly, his viability, and finally, how fun he is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path bot run with no specters and no on-call. Now moving on to the first topic, his KPM. Put simply, Styanax is a gun frame with little to no ability to scale into later levels. The reason for this is because his kit just simply doesn't allow it between his really bad suck skill and his inability to stay alive. What do I mean by his bad suck skill? So, compared to other grouping tools, Styanax's is by far the worst one in the game. Why? Well, for many reasons. Firstly, it is affected by LOS more so than almost every other grouping tool in the entire game. The only one that felt just as bad for LOS was Geyer's 2. Every other ability was significantly better. It didn't really care if enemies were behind walls or not, it would just suck them. Such as Ensnare, Mags 2, and Airburst. They are all 20 times better as a grouping tool. Not only that, but Styanax's grouping tool, you have to aim, and not only do you have to aim, but you cannot use it on enemies that are affected by Overguard. Yes, this is true for all of the other grouping tools, but there's a big difference. With the other grouping tools, you just throw them at the ground, and it doesn't matter if one of the enemies has Overguard, because all of the enemies that don't have Overguard will get sucked. With Styanax's, you'll throw it at the enemy, and as you press it, you'll be like, oh crap, they have Overguard, and just nothing happens. You waste your time, and you waste your energy. Sure, you can say, just look at the enemy to see if it has Overguard, forehead, but if you do this every single time you throw your one, I promise you, you are not getting good KPM, and it's just as simple as that. There are other issues, such as enemies body blocking it mid-throw, such as an Arctic Eximus, Nullifier, or an Ancient Healer walking up and giving it Overguard as you're throwing it. So all of these issues, on top of the fact that it has the absolute worst hit detection for line of sight, makes his grouping tool pretty mediocre. This also makes his second ability for armor stripping pretty mediocre because it's just a conal that is intended to be used after you group all the enemies together, but he's really bad at grouping the enemies together. His third ability is whatever, it doesn't increase his KPM, and same with his fourth ability. His fourth ability, before he was nerfed, struggled to maintain a good enough KPM to where you wouldn't have to spam life support modules, and now that it's been nerfed, it is absolutely terrible. You can no longer rely on using his 4 to keep your life support up. You now have to use AoE weapons and only use his 4 just to have some fun. It is absolutely terrible. So at the end of the day, because of all these issues, this means that his KPM is extremely average for a gun frame, meaning that I have to give his KPM a B. Now moving on to a survivability, and it really does not get much better here. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, Styanax is a tank Warframe. However, he doesn't have any form of survivability in his entire kit other than his 3 giving shields on kill. However, this is not nearly enough to stay alive by itself, so you have to pair it with a boatload of mods giving you damage reduction. And not only do you have to pair it with a bunch of mods, but they are a bunch of annoying to use mods such as jump in the air. Yes, if you don't plan on doing extended missions, you don't have to worry about this. But we are comparing all of the Warframes and extended missions to really tell how good they are, and Styanax just does not make the cut. Based on the fact that you have to do so much just to keep him alive without a shield gate build, leads him to a very bad survivability rank, on top of the fact that even using a tank build, using his 4 can kill you because there's no way to cancel it, and you're a sitting duck while casting it. Even with a shield gate build, his survivability doesn't go up too much. Why? Well, it's because you're using an ability that costs 70 energy to shield gate with. His sustain is iffy, and it is very easy to find yourself out of energy. What happens when you run out of energy with a shield gate build? You die. So all of this just leads Styanax to a very mediocre survivability rank of a C+. Now, moving on to the third topic, is viability, and unfortunately, Styanax's story does not get better. Of course, when I talk about viability for the different Warframes, I mostly mean, is there an area in the game where they excel, or at least perform better than the average Warframe? And unfortunately, the only place for Styanax where I can consider him being decent at, not even good, decent at, is disruption missions. The reason that he is okay in disruption is because his frail survivability isn't that big of a detriment, and his point and click armor strip is pretty good, as well as there's just isn't as high enemy density in disruption missions. So his armor strip is better there than, say, a survival where there's just a million enemies everywhere. And disruption, there won't be as many, so you can just go armor strip most of the enemies, kill them, get your key, and move on. Outside of that, he is not good in any mission type other than if you're helping a new player and you don't want to just hard carry them, so you can just activate Styanax's 3 and give them some energy so they can actually play the game. That's like the only thing that he has going for him, is being a good supporting frame for a literal new player that's like MR2. Outside of that, the second you take him to the Steel Path, he becomes pretty bad, and then the second that you start taking him into Endurance Steel Path missions, he is outright terrible. Not to mention the fact that Styanax performs very poorly against 3 of the factions. Styanax performs very poorly against Corpus. He is just okay against Infested. He gets hard countered by Ancient Healers, but everything else he's fine against an Infested. But Ancient Healers hard counter him so much that it's just kind of an L. And Corrupted, of course, have Nullifiers and Ancient Healers, so he's really bad against Corrupted as well, meaning that the only faction where he's okay against is Grineer. I will give Styanax's viability rank a C, and it's entirely carried by him being decent at disruption. Now, moving on to the final topic, how fun is he to play? And oh boy, this is biased. So, on release, I actually thought Styanax was extremely fluid and fun to play, albeit I still don't think he was good. I thought he was just average, but then they nerfed him 4 separate times. Yes, a few of them were bug fixes, but they did lower his potential. Not only that, one of them was an outright nerf, where they made it so his 4 was affected by LOS and it no longer hit enemies through bodies and walls. Another stealth nerf that they did that I don't believe was documented is on release, whenever you press Styanax's 4, you were allowed to switch to your operator to cancel it. That way, if you got your shield broken and you thought that you were going to die, you could switch to your operator to survive. You can now no longer do that. So if you press your 4 and your shield immediately gets broken, now you just die, and there's no counterplay. Not only that, they ruined all of the fluidity of his kit, because before, you could actually use his entire kit to kill the enemies. You could group them up with the 1, or you could just simply press Breach Surge, and then 4, and then if there was a tanky enemy, you could armor strip them while you were casting your 4, and it was just fluid gameplay that was kind of fun. And they took it all away, and now they made it an average Warframe, outright terrible and not fun. So I would not feel comfortable giving his fun rank anything higher than a D. In conclusion, Styanax is a C tier Warframe who on release was still average, but was fluid and fun to play, and was later nerfed relentlessly and is now no longer fun, and went from being average to well below average, and his only use case is now by playing as a worse Night Equinox, a worse Trinity, or a worse Haro.